I'd like to welcome everybody to this Zoominar as part of the Futurity Now series, which is being organised by a consortium of universities from around the world, including Lucerne, the Institute for Advanced Legal Studies at Lucerne. And we've got Steve Howe here. Thanks for putting this together, Steve. My Centre for the Law, Arts and Humanities, Romero, University of Helsinki, University of Witwatersrand, and the University of Adelaide has been co-convening this particular event with me. So it's a small but growing group of universities with an interest in law and the humanities, with a focus on, I suppose, on legal theory on the one hand, but also on law, literature and culture on the other hand. Today's event is as part of that series, which is called Colonial Legal Imaginaries and Southern Legal Literary Futures, reflects that constellation of interests. And as we said when we first started to get this together, it's a way of thinking about literature, imagination and post-colonialism in a wide range of contexts. We were really keen to get people who could talk not just about Australia, for example, in the Australian context, as important as that is, but about places all over the world and different legal imaginaries and different literary futures. I should make sure before I get any further into this, something that I'm always, really sloppy about, and let me just say now, acknowledge that this, certainly myself, I'm on Ngambri and Ngunnawal land. It's land that has never been ceded. It's land is sovereign land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And I think putting some meaning into those words, thinking about what that really means, what that presence really means, and how we can use the resources that we all have at our disposal as academics, as thinkers and as writers to really engage with those issues and to animate them now and into the future is really, I think, one of the core tasks of academics thinking about law, literature, culture and society. So I'm really thrilled to have four wonderful speakers from all corners of the globe talking about an extraordinary range of literary, legal and geopolitical constellations. And the first paper is by Debolina Dutta. And Debolina finished her PhD from the University of Melbourne quite recently and is working at the moment on turning it into a book. And she's talking today about cultivating a post-colonial literary legal imagination. And she's doing that in relation to translating Sunil Gangopadhyay's Beni Daskara Mundu.
Hello everyone, I'm very sorry for not being able to do this presentation live today. And thank you Shane Chalmers and Desmond Manderson, both for accommodating my request to join a little later and for inviting me to be a part of this panel. Now, what I'm going to do today is share some thoughts on translating a Bangla short story into English. This was a collaborative work that I did with Oishik Sarkar, my colleague at Jindal Global Law School. And along with the translation, we wrote translators afterward, both of which were published as a chapter in the Routledge Handbook of International Law and the Humanities, co-edited by Shane Chalmers and Sandhya Pahuja. Now, before talking about the story and what I think it offers us for cultivating a post-colonial literary legal imagination, I will share a bit of context about why I see it as relevant to the topic of the panel. Now, the title of this panel is a combination of two distinct set of ideas, colonial legal imaginaries and southern literary futures. The correlation between these two set of ideas is predominantly thought from a southern location in two ways. It's thought that colonial legal imaginaries have foreclosed the possibilities for the South to have a sovereign literary future of its own because it has characterized the South through law and science and literature as not having a past or a history. For instance, someone like J.S. Mill in his 1859 tract on liberty characterized the South as being in the state of non-age, meaning that since we don't have a history, we haven't even stepped into civilization. Another way in which this relationship between colonial legal imaginaries and Southern literary futures is generally thought is how the violence of the colonial legal imagination denies Southern peoples the capacity to narrate their own stories, even if these are taken to exist. Again, it is an idea which suggests that if narration happens, it will happen on the terms set by colonial legal imaginaries. So simply put, in both of these senses, colonial law is understood to negate the existence of Southern literature because the literary can only be colonial. If it's not colonial, it is not literary. So then in the Southern imagination as well, we end up with the conception of a South which is a victim of the denial of a history and without the imagination to tell our own stories. Now, from a contemporary post-colonial perspective, however, it is not only the relationship between the European colonizer and the non-European colonized that is of significance for imagining a literary future. It is the relationship between the non-European colonizer and the non-European colonized that is very crucial for thinking with our present times and simultaneously working towards the future. So for this reason, I'm interested in rethinking the predominant ways of understanding that I just talked about, of understanding the relationship between colonial legal imaginations and Southern literary futures. For me, this story, Benilosh Koren Mundu, is not about writing back or writing against the colonizer. I find this story of interest not because it is a Southern account that is only a reaction to the onslaught of colonialism. The story is definitely critical of colonial legal imaginaries, but it is a modernist take on colonialism, not a nativist one. The modernist in question, the author of the story, Sunil Gangopadhyay, is a Southern figure. What is significant in his account is that it offers insights for cultivating a literary legal imagination of a future that is not shaped as an attempt at recovering a pure and glorious Southern past. Rather, it's about inhabiting the modernity of the Southern present responsibly. Now, it's a story by a modernist Southern literary figure who reimagines the colonial past not to recover nativist or nationalist glory, because he knows what that will do to our present. At the same time, he is extremely critical of the violence in colonial knowledge practices. So how do we produce a Southern literary future that simultaneously resists colonial violence and refuses the impulse to fall back on a nativist or a nationalistic past? This double play is what made us take on the task of translation. But then as a legal scholar, why engage in the work of translation at all? We could have simply written about it. Now, one of the more implicit consequences of being critical about colonial legal imaginaries is that we, and I mean mostly Southern critical thinkers, often unwittingly give up on law. And for any imagination of an emancipatory future, we tend to go to literature. We generally think that literature is emancipatory, law is not, because it is essentially colonial inheritance. From the vantage point of a Southern thinker, I don't think we can go to literature alone for mobilizing our imaginaries of an emancipatory future. To give an example, a prominent source of contemporary Hindutva or Hindu proto-fascist ideology in India is an anti-colonial literary text called Anandamot by a well-known Bengali poet. The text consolidated the concept of a Hindu motherland or the Bharat Mata, which has come to take center stage in our contemporary nationalist agenda. So then the lesson is that our own Southern literary imaginaries are not to be taken uncritically, because an anti-colonial text can simultaneously be deeply exclusionary ethnocentrically and replay that same logic of colonial violence directed not only at the colonizer but those among the colonized who are considered outsiders. So then where do we go for cultivating the imaginaries or emancipatory futures? Because there isn't a place, whether law or literature, that will be available for us to simply go to and pluck out ready resources from. which means that we can neither disclaim the violence of a colonial legal inheritance, nor can we ignore the violence of anti-colonial literary legal imaginaries. While colonial legal imaginaries are racist, what has become of anti-colonial imaginaries in the subcontinent especially is casteist and Islamophobic. To be able to craft an emancipatory future, it might be useful to work out a place from where we don't privilege the literary over law or vice versa, and instead learn to play with both. It's this methodological task that brought me and my co-translator to engage with the Bangla short story that I'll talk about soon. So we wanted to work out what it means for lawyers to not only produce legal knowledge, but also engage in literary knowledge production, where we attribute and carry both literary and legal meaning across languages and genres. Now, this work of translation, in our case, is a collaboration between law and literature. It's a collaboration between our legal imagination and a literary text. As one of its translators, I'm not just producing legal knowledge, but also literary knowledge. I'm translating a literary text from Bangla to English and a fictional children's literature into an academic piece for a law handbook. I'm not using the literary as a resource pool to rehabilitate legal scholarship, because that runs the risk of making our colonial legal inheritance further extractive. Just because I'm a post-colonial subject, I cannot deny my complicity in the colonial project. Therefore, to put it simply, I'm not suggesting that we can transcend this extractive condition of the colonial legal project through translation. That's not what I'm doing at all. But by taking up the task of translation ethically, I'm suggesting that we might be able to negotiate and work through this extractive condition and our contradictory inheritances better. Now, coming to the short story, Beni Lashkorer Mundu, and its literal translation is Beni Lashkor's Head, is written by Sunil Gangopadhyay, a renowned Bengali author who lived and worked in Calcutta till his death in 2012. He is well known for his poetry, short stories, essays, travelogues, novels, detective fiction, as well as historical fiction, a genre that earned him fame and popularity. Beni Lashkorer Mundu, the short story that Oshik and I translated, is a work of historical fiction. Written in 1972, it was first published in a children's literary magazine. However, despite its publication for a young audience, the imaginative world that the story depicts is adult, male, and set in British India. The story revolves around the head of a man called Beni Lashkor, who is a Mukhtar by profession. Now, Mukhtars, they don't exist anymore, were a category of native lawyers of small stature, also known as Bangla-speaking lawyers. And unlike the proper lawyers and magistrates at the time with a law degree, who had to carry out their legal practice in English, the Mukhtars carried out their business in the native language. So Beni Lashkor in this story is the possessor of a legal mind, but a lesser one. And in the story, it is his head containing a lesser intellect that brings the interpretive tools of modern law and science, the two most authoritative pillars of colonial racial superiority, into crisis. What happened was that the spirits of the aggrieved, who were already dead, would come and tell Beni Lashkor, who was guilty of the crime committed against them. Because of this, he started winning the most difficult of cases where there were no evidence to prove someone's innocence or guilt. That's why Beni Lashkor started calling himself the Lord Healer of Lost Cases, which is also the title of a translated version. The other important character in the story, apart from Beni Lashkor, is a British judge who is a representative of colonial legal imaginaries. The judge was fascinated by Beni Lashkor's abilities and asked him to surrender his head so that it could be examined by Western science for it to interpret the magical mind of the non-Western anomalous subject. In other words, colonial law was recruiting Western science to add to the archive of imperial knowledge. Later, as the story progresses, due to various events, the judge experiences a change of heart and abandons his project. Now, if you are interested to know why that happens, I'd urge you to read the translation as I wouldn't spend any more time on the story itself. So instead, I'm going to focus on a key aspect of the story that is of significance for my presentation today. Now, I will now focus on the nature of syncretism that the short story helps us imagine, not by rejecting but by reworking the colonial legal imagination. Now, in his telling of the crisis that surrounds Beni Loshkor's head, Gangopadhyay, the author of the short story, conjures a fictional syncretic world that is extremely pertinent for a contemporary India and the imaginaries of its future. Our protagonist, Beni Loshkor, self-identifies as Hindu in the story, but Gangopadhyay's choice of surname for him is a curious one. Loshkor, or its phonetic equivalent Laskar, can be historically traced back to mean an Indian, African, or Arab seafarer employed to work on British ships during colonial times. In the Bengal of the time being described in the story, Laskar was a surname that was shared by both Hindus and Muslims. Now, with the rise of a pronounced identity-based communal divide in post-partition Bengal in the early 1900s, Muslim Bengalis have retained Laskar beginning with an L, while Hindu Bengalis have altered this surname to Naskar beginning with an N in an attempt to demarcate them from the Muslims. The story is thus a fictional rendition of a colonial Indian past in which syncretism is a quotidian reality even under feudal arrangements. Now, writing from a post-colonial context about a historically communalized past, what might have been the source of this syncretic literary imagination is hard to tell. However, for us, this imagination also appears to be shaped by Gangopadhyay's inheritance of the secular ethos of the post-colonial Indian constitution. The Indian constitution understands secularism as the coexistence of multiple religions, unlike in the West, where the thrust is primarily on the separation of the state and church. Now, this distinctive version of post-colonial secularism is founded on the constitutional freedom to profess and practice the religion of one's choice, as opposed to the idea that to be secular, one has to be non-religious. A tying of the literary and the legal, whereby we can acknowledge the combined contribution to the making of Gangopadhyay's fictional universe, was necessary for our task of translation. Because otherwise, we would ascribe his syncretism to a literary sensibility alone. Speaking from a post-colonial position, we know that syncretism cannot be unproblematically and singularly handed over to the realm of literature, just like it cannot be done to law. For instance, Vande Mataram, which means the salutation to the mother, which was the clarion call for solidarity and resistance during the Swadeshi movement, was a hymn that appeared in the iconic 1882 Bengali novel Anandamot, which I mentioned earlier as well. Now, this hymn later turned into a Hindu rallying cry during Hindu-Muslim violence in the wake of the 1905 partition of Bengal. Similarly, the constitutional imagination of a secular India is argued to have been founded on Hindu ideals. To give an example, Article 1 of the Constitution of India opens with the words, India that is Bharat, ... signifying the name to reflect the ancient pre-British and pre-Muslim era of a glorious Hindu past. Now, given this contradictory nature of the archives of both the law and literature in the making of the post-colonial condition, it becomes ever more important to cultivate a literary legal imagination with responsibility, one that takes the double bind of our contradictory inheritances seriously. The story may be read, therefore, as an invitation to think about a post-colonial jurisprudence that recognizes law as a body of knowledge formed through contradictory inheritances. The British judge, a mind trained in modern law, tries to deploy the Western epistemological frameworks of interpretation at his disposal to find a rational explanation for Beni Madhav's condition. His project is interpretive. He looks to decipher Beni Madhav's head. When both law and science fail, he decides to suspend the pursuit for Beni Madhav's head. Instead, he recognizes both modern laws and science's failure by building a statue in memory of Beni Madhav, dressed in a syncretic choga chapkan, which is a Persian Indian male attire. At the base of the statue, the judge inscribed one line from Shakespeare's Hamlet, and I quote, "On heaven and on earth there are many such things, Horatio, that you cannot even imagine." The quote tellingly demonstrates the Western rational man's acknowledgement of his own finitude on the one hand, and on the other, the judge's suspension of scientific juridical reasoning to embrace the speculative possibilities of literature. When we inherit Beni Madhav's story in the form of the statue, we have to accommodate in our post-colonial imagination the role that both Beni Madhav and the judge played in the making of a syncretic imaginary. From being rivals, they became unlikely collaborators. In the figure of Beni Madhav, a creation of the post-colonial imagination, the legal and the literary minds of the judge and the bard also find convergence. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And I'm sorry that the recording quality was not the best, but hopefully it was enough for everyone to hear, with a really kind of interesting depth and variety of the things that Debolina was saying. I think without any further ado, we're going to go on to Christopher Gevers. And Christopher works in the School of Law at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And he works on a very wide range of international and jurisprudential and law and humanities related themes. And he's talking today about lands beyond the white world. Over to you, Chris.
Hi, everyone. Sorry about that. I'm just waiting for my very slow computer to wake up. Can you see my slides? Can you guys hear?
Yeah, perfect. Very clear.
So thanks, everyone. Thanks particularly Shane and Des for inviting me. It's wonderful to be here. I'm going to speak for hopefully 20 minutes, and I'm going to speak more or less for being a good literalist. I'm going to speak to half the first half will be about colonial legal imaginaries and international legal imaginaries in particular, and the second half I'm going to try to think about lands beyond the white world or southern literary futures. So in the mid-1870s, Robert Louis Stevenson completed a handwritten draft of what would be his first novel, to be called either The Hair Trunk or The Ideal Commonwealth. Stevenson described its plot to a friend as the most absurd story of a lot of Cambridge fellows who are going to found a new society by colonizing the Navigator Islands in the South Seas. These Cambridge fellows decide that in order to break with old traditions and begin a new world, unfettered and pure-minded, they require a new conscience, specifically an international one. As the leader explains, our scheme is a special case because it is international. As such, from the moment these Cambridge fellows signed their Declaration of Independence for the ideal Commonwealth, they became governed not by domestic law or by morality, but by international law, which governed not only their relations with the soon-to-be colonized peoples of the Navigator Islands, but also their relations with other European states and their fellow citizens in Britain, who, as the group's leader shows as co-conspirators, are no more to us and no less than any tribe of painted cannibals on Coral Island. He goes on, we shall treat the childhood proprietor of England the same way we shall treat the new proprietor on the Gold Coast, with an entire and imperturbable disregard of his rights, which are civic but not international. Around the same time, the story that was too absurd for Stevenson to commit to publish in fiction became the basis for the reinvention of international law by a group of white men who established Institut de Droit International, led in part by an actual Cambridge fellow, John Westlake. These men of 1873, as Marty Kochkaniemi affectionately calls them, inaugurated a modern international law through their own international conscience and constituted a new society as well, the International Society of the White Race, as John Westlake defined it. At the center of these world-making projects of Stevenson and the founders of international law lay a white international, a co-fabricated and racialized social, historical, and geographical imaginary that became the international order in the 20th century. An international imaginary that outlived formal decolonization and continues to structure the world's and world-making practices of international law today and its historical, geographical, and social imaginations, as well as its futures and its futurity itself. However, from the middle of the 19th century, Black radicals repeatedly turned to literature alongside their non-fictional and transnational activism in order to subvert this colonial legal imaginary and its socio-political, historical, and geographical certainties. In doing so, these Black internationalists, to paraphrase Ruha Benjamin, turned to novels to both imagine and craft the worlds that they could not live without and dismantle the world that they could not live within. So my contribution aims to trace these poetic and political world-making and unmaking practices through the novels of three Black internationalists in particular, Pauline Hopkins, W.B. Du Bois, and Peter Abrams, and to map their shared insurgent socio, historical, and geographical counter-imaginaries. In doing so, I'm aiming to surface the alternative clocks and maps of global racial resistance and suggest pathways to lands beyond the white world, as Du Bois put it, and its colonial legal imaginaries. However, in order to do so, I want to briefly set out how, as what Joseph Slaughter calls mutually enabling fictions, the world-making practices of Stevenson and the men of 1873, as well as that of their descendants and disciples, circulated and sedimented a colonial legal imaginary predicated on the mythology of whiteness, the white mythology of Occidental history, a capital H, and what J.M. Blood called the colonizer's model of the world. So in the first draft of The Ideal Commonwealth, Stevenson described how colonialism resulted from, quote, an inferior race dwindling, resulted in, quote, an inferior race dwindling and disappearing like snow burning flax before the advance of the superior. And there Stevenson stopped, and on reflection scratched out the passage and replaced it with the following more gentle description, quote, civilization advances with gigantic strides, end quote. Much of the history of international law might be told as the redescription of Darwinian-inspired passages of genocidal violence as civilization advances with gigantic strides, and the inability and even in critical accounts to name whiteness. In fact, international law's most important and violent disciplinary act might be a disavowal of race, its inability to talk about race, or at least to talk about it gently, to smuggle it into its racialized histories and geographies that construct its disciplinary world, and at its most ambitious and actual one, and then decadently disavow its animating racial dynamic. However, not everyone got the message that race and whiteness was not to be spoken about. John Westlake, the honorary president of the men of 1873, declared that international law was a product of the international society of the white race, as the rules which are internationally recognized between white men. A few years later, Westlake would redefine the international society as a society of all the states of European blood. As I've argued elsewhere, contrary to Koshkiniemi's gentle revision, the consciousness and conscience that brought and held the men of 1873 together was not an elusive sensibility about matters international or a matter of feeling and of intuition that was impossible to articulate. It was plainly whiteness, and at times it was plainly articulated. It formed both a part of the broader consciousness of white solidarity that informed diplomatic affairs at the time, and of the sudden emotional conversion that Du Bois in 1910 said had led some people to be painfully conscious of their whiteness all of a sudden. Moreover, it was written in blood, both literal and figurative. The novels of Stevenson and the writers of international law did not simply inscribe this white consciousness, they produced it. What Du Bois rhetorically described as a sudden emotional conversion following the discovery of personal whiteness was in fact a project. And the white internationalism of the men of 1873 was part and parcel of this production of whiteness as a global social reality, as Charles Knowles puts it. Similarly, if the early 19th century American literature, as Toni Morrison has shown, took as its concern the architecture of a new white man, one of the concerns of late 19th century literature was the architecture of a new transatlantic or international white man. To paraphrase Du Bois, the wave on wave of increasingly virulent new religion of whiteness washed up on the shores of both sides of the Atlantic, much like Robert Louis Stevenson. Robert Louis Stevenson would eventually also wash up on the shores of Navigator Islands in 1889 to live out the fantasy of his would-be first novel, where he continued to produce fictional and non-fictional worlds. The first was a novel called The Wrecker in 1892, which bore striking resemblance to his first attempt at a novel, albeit a little darker and blood bespattered, according to one reviewer. Another story of disaffected white men who become enchanted by the promise of adventure and fortune in the South Island seas. The second, a footnote to history, promised the model of both the present and the past at the same time, or as Stevenson put it, a piece of contemporary history in the most exact sense. As Stevenson explained at the outset of a footnote to history, The story I have to tell is still ongoing as I write, yet for all its actuality and the part played in it by mails and telegraph and iron warships, the ideas and manners of the native actors date back to before the Roman Empire. Simply put, for Stevenson and for many white world makers since, a model of the present non-white, non-European world was per force a model of Europe's past. This progressive evolutionarism was repeatedly emphasized in Stevenson's contemporaneous novel, The Wrecker, where the South Seas were described as of another world and surely of a different time. As he watches the coming and going of the schooners manned with brown-skinned, soft-spoken, sweet-eyed native sailors from Yap and the South Seas, that novel's protagonist declares San Francisco to be the port of entry to another world and an early epoch in man's history, end quote. As Anthony Anghie has shown, this linear evolutionary framework in which the European world is the past and the non-European world is the past and the European world is the future, and such that non-European world may illuminate aspects of the past of Europe, of the European world, that may otherwise remain hidden, was central to the late 19th century founding of international law. In particular, this progressive evolutionism was indispensable to the reinvention of international law and inextricable from the biological racism of the period, which drew on the ideas of Darwin and Spencer via the more sanitized account of Henry Summer Maine. This white mythology parading its history was not only racial, it was spatial. In The Wrecker, Stevenson describes this through his lead character looking wistfully onto the Pacific, much like Stevenson himself did. And quote, "I stood there on the extreme shores of the West and of today. 1700 years ago and 7,000 miles to the east, the legionaries stood perhaps on the wall of Antonius and looked northwards towards the mountains of the Picts. For all the interval of time and space, when I looked from the cliff house of the broad Pacific, was that man's heir and analog, each of us standing on the verge of the Roman Empire, or as we now call it, Western civilization, each of us gazing onwards into zones unromanized," end quote. In collapsing the geographical and historical and racializing them, and plotting the trajectory of civilization from the West outwards, Stevenson reproduced what J.M. Blount has called the colonizer's model of the world, in terms of which the natural, normal, logical, ethical flow of culture, of innovation, of human causality is from Greater Europe, the permanent geographical center or genus, outwards towards a permanent periphery of non-Europe, at all times in history down to the present. The colonizer's model of the world, which lay beneath the surface of Stevens' incomplete novel, was made explicit in The Wrecker, but there was an important shift in the interceding 2 decades. Europe had become Greater Europe, with the sense that its center had shifted westwards to the United States. Westlake's International Society of the White Race had expanded to include Europe's settler colonies, what Gerald Horne refers to as its revolting spawn, which were now Westlake's states of European blood. Stevenson's novel in this respect was part of a broader struggle over geography, which, as Said has shown, aimed to impose a particular imaginative geography in order to facilitate the actual colonization of the non-European world. As Said puts it, the prototypical imperial novel, Robinson Crusoe, was certainly not accidentally about a European who creates a fiefdom for himself on a distant non-European island. In this respect, Stevenson's early unpublished drafts certainly fell into a well-worn path, except that the prize was not just property, it was whiteness itself. So, as one of the earliest and most significant, although still underappreciated novels in the tradition of Black internationalist fiction, Pauline Hopkins' Of One Blood, or The Hidden Self, both mapped the terrain on which novels and later forms of poetic revolt would confront this colonial legal imaginary and subverted its history and geography. Serialized in the Colored magazine in 1902 and 1903, Of One Blood is a novel of a lost world genre that tells the story of Real Briggs, a passing Black American medical student who, after completing his studies at Harvard, is unable to secure a job due to the color line and has to join a 2-year expedition to Africa in search of ancient Ethiopian cities and hidden treasure which the shifting sands of the Sahara have buried for centuries. The expedition's plan is to use an ancient map to find the ruins of Romero, which, like the Wakanda of Marvel's Black Panther, lies hidden beneath extensive swamps which form an impassable barrier to strangers. After being separated from the rest of the party, Briggs stumbles upon a thriving hidden city of Telazar, as opposed to the ruins of the city, which is peopled by the direct descendants of the inhabitants of Romero, the capital of ancient Ethiopia. This kingdom is secure from the intrusions of a world that has forgotten it, and its inhabitants await the coming of their king who shall restore the Ethiopian race to its ancient glory. That king turns out to be Briggs, and at the end of the novel, Briggs, now called King Ergamemnes, remains in Telazar to fulfill his destiny to ensure the upbuilding of humanity and the restoration of the Ethiopian race, and prepares to defend it against the ominous advance of mighty white nations penetrating the dark, mysterious forest of his native land. I'm just going to give a quick overview of the three now. I'll make some threads between them. The lead character of One Blood was likely modeled on W.B. Du Bois, and Will Briggs might well have inspired the lead in Du Bois's own 1928 novel, Dark Princess, a romance. This is the novel, it is a story of a romance between an educated Black American doctor, Matthew Towns, and Princess Cordelia of the Kingdom of Guador, and the struggle of a secretive international organization called the Great Central Committee of Yellow, Brown, and Black, which represents what Towns calls the real and darker world, against the widespread, deep, powerful determination to make this a white world. The story begins in Berlin in 1923, where Matthew meets Princess Cordelia, who invites him to join a struggle against the hegemony of the white world, waged through this Great Central Committee of Yellow, Brown, and Black as a representative of Pan-Africa. Pete Abrams' Read for Adomo of 1956 is a romantic cipher by one of the leading figures of Pan-Africanism, written on the eve of African decolonization and set in London in a fictitious decolonizing political entity called Pan-Africa. The central character, Michael Adomo, who closely resembles Kwame Nkrumah, spends the first part of the novel, The Dream, agitating for African independence in London alongside other freedom fighters, closely modeled on his fellow Pan-Africanists Kenyatta Azikiwe, as well as Padmore and Abrams himself. In the second part, the reality, Adomo returns to home to lead Pan-Africa to independence and becomes its inaugural prime minister. However, in his efforts to hold together and develop Pan-Africa, Adomo makes enemies at home and abroad, and in the end is killed by his compatriots after selling out a fellow freedom fighter to secure technical aid from white-ruled Pluralia, a neighboring settler colony closely resembling South Africa. So through the world-making functions of the novel, these Black radicals both subverted the socio-political, historical, and geographical imaginaries underpinning modern international law, and imagined futures beyond the white world and its colonial legal imaginaries. So against the racial fabrications of Stevenson, Westlake, and others, Hopkins, as the title suggested, subverted the late 19th century biological racism central claim, as well as its master sign, i.e. blood. Crucially, however, Hopkins did not descend into colorblind non-racialism. Rather, as Hazel Carby points out, Hopkins links the degeneration of a race, and the so-called white race in particular, to the abuse of power and the use of brutality against subordinate groups, socially, politically, and economically. In this structural understanding of global white supremacy, it prefigured not only critical race theory, but also the novels and fiction of Du Bois, for whom whiteness was a social construct that underpinned the socio-political system of white domination. So in the opening pages of The Dark Princess, the protagonist Matthew Towns sits at a cafe in Berlin and traces the articulations of the global color line, drawn at the hands of the mighty organization of white folk that he is at war with. As he says, the same vast remorseless machine of whiteness in Berlin as in New York, which he calls the white Leviathan. Through the course of the novel, Du Bois maps this white world globally and theoretically, detailing its legal, political, social, cultural, and economic dimensions and their intersections. In this respect, Du Bois's reference to the white Leviathan is portentous, as the conceptualization of white supremacy that emerges in Dark Princess is very similar to how Charles Mills reworks the social contract of Hobbes's Leviathan, and that of his Western social contractarian thinkers, as a racial contract. As such, the novel can be read not only as an archive of Du Bois's alternative international at the time, but also for its critical reinscription and subversive mapping of global white supremacy as a socio-political system. Insofar as the white mythology of history is concerned, Hopkins of One Blood reverses the historical progress of knowledge of the white mythology by claiming that from Ethiopia came all the arts and cunning inventions that make the West's modern glory. As Hazel Carby notes, the journey of rural doctor on an archaeological expedition to Africa was a journey into Hopkins' vision of Black history and a challenge to the mythology of the superiority of Western civilization. Similarly, like Hopkins, Abraham's embrace of modernization and Read for Adomo is based on an understanding that ancient Africa had contributed to the unfolding of world culture, which is currently called Western, and that its great advances in science and its great advances in sciences and material prosperity. As Abrahams insisted at the time, drawing on the South African lineage, Western culture is a world culture and not reserved for Europeans only. And then finally, As a result of the advances in optical character recognition technology and the mass digitization of books, it has become evident in recent times just how deftly and systematically Hopkins subverted the imaginative geography of the novels of Haggard, Buchan, and other colonial romances, as well as contemporary writings about Africa more generally. To date, scholars have identified 143 passages of One Blood that are borrowed and reworked from other texts, including John Hartley Coombs' Dr. Livingstone, and Haggard's She, A History of Adventure. While some have labeled this as simple plagiarism, Of One Blood can be productively read as an act of poetic revolt through the resignification of the very racial and colonial discourse and logics that underpin not only these texts, but the white mythology more generally, and its imaginative geography in particular. As our Dworkin has shown, there's much to be gained from parsing the passages of Hopkins that Hopkins is alleged to have plagiarized from fictional and non-fictional texts that reflected the dominant colonial discourse about Africa and the West. So one particularly telling example from Of One Blood is the conscription of the following passage from Coombs' Dr. Livingstone. So Coombs writes, contrary to all his expectations, Dr. Livingstone found that the character of the country improved as he advanced to the interior. This circumstance is very much at variance with the prevailing notion of Europeans respecting the central region of Africa. It has been believed by many that the great part of this ground, which is marked on the maps as unexplored, is a howling wilderness and an arid, sterile, and uninhabitable country. So Hopkins does not simply contest the content of the prevailing notions of Europeans respecting central regions of Africa. She reworks the text of Coombs itself. So she writes, the character of the country improved as they neared the interior. We will notice that it was in variance with the European idea respecting Central Africa capitals, which brands these regions as howling wilderness and an uninhabitable country, end quote. Clearly, Hopkins does not simply transcribe this passage from Coombs, she critically resignifies it in at least three ways. First, by rendering the prevailing notions of Europeans as the European idea concerning Africa, she recasts it as a discourse or ideology rather than simply the personal impressions of individual Europeans about Africa. Second, by simply narrating how the country improved as it neared the interior and abandoning Coombs' incredulity at the fact, Hopkins reverses the heart of darkness trope so central to their Western imaginative geography. Third, by capitalizing Central Africa, Hopkins recognizes its political subjecthood as opposed to being a mere geographical region. Similarly, I'll end here. Similarly, writing on the eve of decolonization, Abraham subverts the imaginative political geography of literature and international law through Ruth Fuadoma's central polity, Pan-Africa. Placing Abraham's novel within the Pan-Africanism's political and literary traditions reveals Pan-Africa as neither the Gold Coast, or soon to be Ghana, nor an allegorical amalgam of it and other would-be states hewed along former colonial lines, but a continent-wide political union. This Pan-Africa is also at the heart of Du Bois's novel, which goes further by reimagining the global international order itself as governed by a great central committee of yellow, brown, and black, representing the darker nations of the world. In all three novels, their geographical and geopolitical pivot shifts from Europe and the white world to Pan-Africa. Against this geographical model of the world, where, as Blythe notes, civilization marches from Athens to Rome to Paris to London, and then perhaps sets sail for New York, like Stevenson, these counter-geographies, the revolution moved from and between Harlem and Liberia, and culminated in the land beyond the white world called Pan-Africa. So by way of conclusion, through the radical reimaginations in these novels, they serve as alternative clocks and maps of global racial resistance and suggest pathways to lands beyond the white world and its colonial legal imaginaries. However, they also serve as warnings from the archives of the future of what might result from the failure to unsettle and ultimately end the white world at the center of these imaginaries and of international law. A white world whose racial, geographical, and historical certainties have been violently reasserted of late in the wake of the latest European war. Such that to repurpose Du Bois's lament from over a century ago, in the midst of another European war, despite our stream of travel, the cables of Yap and the swift flying trains and steamers, somehow news and embassies from Pan-Africa, this land beyond the white world, filter out even more slowly than before the war. Thanks.
Yeah, so that I was just saying, and really performing the fact that we couldn't all applaud in this environment, and that's a pity, because there was some fascinating conjunctions and connections being drawn between literary works and literary traditions there, and hopefully we'll have time to get into that a little bit more after our talk. So You know, another title, Shane, for this might have been Around the World in 80 Minutes. And in the spirit of that, we keep moving from continent to continent. We're now moving to our third continent, the Americas, where Luis Gómez Romero is going to talk to us about utopian literary traditions in the work of subcommandant Marcos. Luis.
Thank you, Des. Just want to acknowledge my respect for earliers, present, past, and emerging. And I'm presenting this from unceded Wari land. So I prepared some slides because I want to show you some pictures, and we'll keep it. Just let me share my screen. There it is. So this is, I want to address the work of Subcomandante Marcos, who is currently known as Subcomandante Galeano in 2015. His persona, as Marcos, as a spokesperson of the Zapatistas, was declared dead because a teacher, an indigenous teacher, was killed by paramilitary in Chiapas, and then he adopted the name of this teacher, Galeano, which is also the name of a Uruguayan writer. So Marcos is now Galeano. But we will go back to his work in his time as Marcos from 1994 onwards to talk about or to address utopia, not as an object, not as a text, not as an artifact, but as practice. And indeed, Utopia was thought originally, it's a very complex book, a very complex little book, and was thought originally as this sort of colonial practice. First, just to situate ourselves, okay, Utopia 101. So Utopia, it's a pun. It comes from Utopia, utopos, that is the good place, and autopos, utopia, that means the non-place. So Utopia is a good place, or the good, just the good republic, the good commonwealth that is not yet here. Utopia is a book that takes us from a realist critique in book 1 to strange politics. Utopia is frequently criticized as fanciful, unrealistic, or in the best of cases, impractical. But this is inaccurate, because since Thomas More, original, wonderful little novel, but the Utopia Now authors have engaged with the economic, political, and legal realities of their time. And this is what we witness, what we see in book 1 of Utopia. But we also have the other part, that is the fictional account and the fictitious society that is described in book 2 is not providing us a model of perfection, but rather an alternative to the familiar. So that when we read the book, then we are estranged about what happens in our world, our institutions, our understanding of justice. And More makes clear this in the last lines, in the ending of book 1, when he says, as a character in Utopia, although I can hardly agree with all that was said, even by a man who is without question both erudite and experienced in human affairs, he's referring to Hythloday, to the voyager who told the story of Utopia, yet I freely admit that there are many features in that utopian commonwealth which I might truly wish for than expect to see in our cities. The thing is that the dream of Utopia is a colonial dream, one of the paradoxes of Utopia is that its isolation, this is plenary isolation, it was originally a peninsula. We learned this in the introduction to the second book of Utopia. And this isolation of its transformation into an island is nothing but a violent imperial spoil. Utopus, the king of Utopia, arrives to the continent, to this peninsula, and then he brings, more says, the rude and uncivilized inhabitants, the native inhabitants of the peninsula, into good government. And after subduing them, he forces them to dig a trench that transforms Utopia into an island, therefore securing its isolation. Well, this colonial dimension of Utopia was taken very seriously by many European minds of the time. Among them, there was a priest, a Spanish priest, Vasco de Quiroga, who we can call the Utopian Bishop. He was sent as a judge to the vice-royalty of New Spain in 1530. This is 3 years after that vice-royalty was created by the Spanish crown as such. And he arrives with Morse Utopia under his arm. And there were grievances at the time because the previous director of like a council of judges that governed over the kingdom of New Spain was Nuño de Balboa, and he had instituted slavery of rebel Amerindians. And Vasco de Quiroga is against this, so he writes a letter. It's not really a treatise; it's a sort of very long letter that is titled "Información in Derecho," is information on law in 1535, and then in this letter he says, well, Amerindians are still living in the golden age, and because they are living in the golden age, then the model of republic, of commonwealth that we need for them, that they are calling for, is Utopia. And then another very important document are his rules and orders for the government of the hospitals of Santa Fe. He had 2 hospitals, 2 pueblos hospitales, hospital towns, one near Mexico City, the other in the region of Michoacán. And in both pueblos hospitales, hospital, but it comes from hospes, from being a guest, from hospitality. Just the people living in the indigenous, the indigenous people living in around that town, around that village, were welcomed as into the institutions of that town. And he basically plagiarized Utopia in implementing, in ordering these societies. For example, he established that the ideal size of the city should be 6,000 families, as in Morse Utopia. Each family should consist between 10 to 16 married adults. Just like Thomas More, he proposed to limit the working day to 6 hours long. Then he established that the fruits of the work, the products of agriculture and craftsmanship, will end up in a shared pool of money, which was in Spanish is called moneda común, and this shared pool of wealth should be used for the commonwealth. The people who lived in these utopian towns have the memory of Vasco de Quiroga and his utopian experiment, but this is one of the first intentional communities ever, still lives in the memory of people. This is a picture of Pátzcuaro in Michoacán, of one of the hospital towns, and the sign says, "Glory and honor to Tata Vasco." Tata in Purépecha, the language of the zone, is the grandfather or the father. The thing with this, of course, it's a colonial experiment. So there was this, we need to share, we need the common good, we need it's the indigenous peoples in this continent are still living in the golden age. So we don't want it to become Europeans. They will be even better than Europeans. So we are going to achieve this using more system. But in the end, the people living in these utopian towns could not have the maximum authority. Should always be a Spanish priest, a Catholic priest. This is what he established. So this is Utopia as a colonial enterprise with one of the best phases of Utopia, and yet still depriving the colonized from their voices. And then we make a big jump of 500 years. In 1992, there were these celebrations in Mexico around the 500th arrival of Christopher Columbus to the continent. And around that time, Mexico was negotiating the North American Free Trade Agreement with the United States and Canada. At the time, the narrative that was the government had established and was supporting was that Mexico finally was entering the first world. So we were emerging from the third world, and we were entering in the third world through the big door of neoliberalism, thanks to free trade. The treaty is signed in 1992. It is ratified in 1993, and it will become current law in the three countries at midnight on 1st January 1994. So the president at the time, that is this Baldman, as you can see, he's very proud here signing the treaty. Carlos Salinas de Gortari, he owns the narrative of the moment. I am the president who brought Mexico to the first world. And half an hour after entering the first world, there is a guerrilla uprising in the southern state of Chiapas, in San Cristobal de las Casas. And there are a few hundred soldiers, guerrilla fighters, who distribute pamphlets among the tourists and the people just around in celebrating New Year in this beautiful colonial town in the state of Chiapas. And what they distribute is known as the first declaration of the Lacandon jungle. That we have these two long quotes, and this is one of these long quotes, because rhetorically what is happening here is very important. This is a summary of the history of Mexico, the colonial history of Mexico, and then an affirmation of the way to move forward in the first person of the plural. The declaration reads, we are a product of 500 years of struggle, first against slavery, then during the War of Independence against Spain led by insurgents, then against US expansionism, then to promulgate our constitution and expel the French Empire from our soil, and later on against the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz, which denied us the application of the reform laws. Then people rebelled, and leaders like Villa and Zapata emerged, poor men just like us. We have been denied the most elemental preparations, and they can use us as cannon fodder and pillage the wealth of our country. They don't care that we have nothing, absolutely nothing, not even a roof over our heads, no land, no work, no healthcare, no food, nor education, nor are we able to freely and democratically elect our political representatives, nor is there independence from foreigners, nor is there peace nor justice for ourselves and our children. But today we say enough is enough. We are the inheritors of the true builders of our nation, the dispossessed. We are millions, and we thereby call upon our brothers and sisters to join this struggle as the only path, so that we will not die of hunger due to the insatiable ambition of a 70-year dictatorship led by a clique of traitors that represents the most conservative and sellout groups. So rhetorically, just many things are happening here. It seems that it is a traditional manifesto, revolutionary manifesto. But what they are using is the first person of the singular. So it's not we, the army, are fighting against you, but since this very moment, they are including everyone in the uprising. It is we, the inheritors and builders of our nation, and we is just everyone. It's the people of Mexico. In this first document, there is no reference to the indigenous substratum of the Zapatista army. The spokesperson of the Zapatistas is a mestizo, that is Marcos, and he explains the reasons of the rising. He explains why they have their faces covered, and he says it is to avoid to have protagonists, so that we are all really equal. And he explains the reference to Emiliano Zapata, the revolutionary from the early 20th century, whose motto was land and liberty. He led a very important campesino peasant revolt in southern Mexico. And then there are 10 days of, or 12 days of combat, of battles, from 1st January to 12th January. On 12 January 1994, then there is thousands of people take the streets. This is not Chiapas, this is Mexico City. And there's this Radon Killa where brothers, justice, 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 the fight continues. So in that day, the government declares a unilateral ceasefire, and 2 days later, an amnesty law is issued. And then the style, the genre used by the Zapatistas is the communique, the political communique. That's their genre par excellence. Marcos publishes on so this is 18 January. It's 18 January 1994. He publishes a communique that is that just turns everything. That is, it is a long dubitatio. That's rhetorically, that is a series of questions in which he asks the government, well, why are you pardoning us? Who gave you the legitimacy to give us pardon? Here are some of the questions that he asks. What do we have to ask forgiveness for? What are they going to pardon us for? For not dying of hunger, for not accepting our misery in silence, for not humbly accepting the huge historic burden of disdain and abandonment, for having risen up in arms when we found all other paths closed. And then he continues with these questions. Who should ask for forgiveness and who can grant it? This document just made a deep impression in Mexican society. It was praised, its prose was praised by Octavio Paz, the Mexican novel. And after this, then the peace talks begin for some time, for a few years. And once the peace talks begin, Marcos changes the style. He is the spokesperson of the Zapatistas, and then he begins including in the communiques, in the political communiques, a series of tales in the postscriptum. The tales have two main characters that I will briefly refer to. One is El Viejo Antonio, the old Antonio, a Mayan elder. The other is Durito de la Lacandona, that is a beetle. And there is humor. The postscriptions are usually humor. I didn't translate this because it would be very difficult to translate. This is a postscriptum and then postscriptum to the postscriptum. He's addressing a student council, and the student council is inviting him to take over the Zócalo, the big square at the center of Mexico City. And then he says, los guerrilleros que toman Zócalos tarde o temprano se hamburguesan. Aburguesar in Spanish means gentrify. So they became bourgeois, but it's also hamburger. So what he's saying is, well, if I leave my struggle, my fight, and begin with demonstrations, etc., then I will gentrify. I will become a hamburger. And then he says, well, now that we are talking about hamburgers, send me two without onion and with onion and without tomato sauce. And so just the humor in the stories changes. And in the postscriptum, a series of stories are introduced that are told by these two characters, Old Antonio and Don Durito de la Lacandona. I want to refer to one story by Old Antonio and one story by Don Durito de la Lacandona. The story by Old Antonio is the story of the Seven Rainbows. Marcos asks, Antonio speaks with the style of oral indigenous storytellers. And Marcos asks him, until when are we Zapatistas going to remain hiding from our Mexican brothers and sisters? And old Antonio tells him the story of seven rainbows. He tells him that the oldest among the old gods built the world, and then they commanded the true people. He's talking about the Mayans, where the true people of corn, to do good deeds, 7 good deeds, and build 7 rainbows. And he says we will stop hiding when we build the 7 rainbows, because the rainbows are bridges of colors and bridges of light, and they are bridges of many colors. Don Durito de la Lacandona, the beetle, is a caricature of a leftist intellectual. He appears for the first time when Marcos is answering to a letter that a girl had written to him. And the story by Durito that I'm going to refer to is the story of the buckskin horse. It's actually the story of a caballo bayo, but bayo is a color and it's very hard to translate. So this is a bayo bean and this is the bayo color. That's it. And so it's brown people. And there's this horse that is a brownish horse. A very poor family has a skinny cat, a limping pig, and the bayo horse. And first, because they are hungry, first they eat the skinny hen, then they eat the limping pig, and before they can eat the bayo horse leaves and gets into another story. And then Marcos asks Durito, he said, well, is that the end? And Durito says, yes, tell the people in a big reunion that Marcos called the Intergalactic Reunion, precisely because it was a call not only to indigenous Mexicans, but to all Mexicans, to all sorts of, regardless of their ethnic background. And so just tell them the story in that way. Around this time is when the Zapatistas change their discourses, their speech, to the ideal of that they summarize in this motto: a world where many worlds fit. In the 4th declaration of the Lacandon Jungle, it is expressed in these terms: brothers and sisters, many worlds walk in the world. Many worlds are made. Many worlds are made for us. There are words and worlds which are lies and injustices. There are words and worlds which are truths and are truthful. We make true words. We have been made from true words. In the world of the powerful, there is no space for anyone but themselves and their servants. In the world we want, everyone fits. In the world we want, many worlds fit. And that's, so this literature actually doing stuff. Literature actually doing justice, because since then people have been acting on this, on the tales of Antonio, on the tales of Durito. The message in the end, that this is a Zapatista utopia, is that we are all Zapatistas, because the oppression, the insult, the injustice against indigenous peoples all over the world offend all of us. So it's not just circumscribed to an indigenous struggle. It's a justice for everyone, because we build this. We are the good men, and we build these bridges of colors. Then we can enter this world. We can make this world a world in which many worlds fit. And there's a video there that I was going to show you, but that is a risky operation, considering that we are in Zoom, and if I show it and then the internet connection gets strained, but I'm going to share the link so that you can see it actually inactive. It's the people from all ethnic backgrounds putting with the Zapatista masks and then taking it off as we listen to the political manifesto. And that's it. Thank you for listening to me.
Lewis, thank you very much. That was, as usual, a wild and gripping ride. And your analysis of rhetoric or literature as politics was really quite compelling. So thanks a great deal for that. So I suppose, having in some ways travelled to all of these different places and familiarised ourselves with the exotic, it's only right and just that we return back home to Australia and exoticise the familiar. Specifically, I think, the drover's wife in its various incarnations. And for that, I'm very pleased to introduce our good friend and colleague, Honni van Rijswijk, who's based at UTS. Honni.
Thanks, Des. Can everyone hear me? I think I've got the internet sorted. It's just a heads up that it's bedtime here for my 7-year-old, so there might be shouts and things in the background, but we're trying to kind of keep that under control. I also want to acknowledge that I'm on Camaragal country, land that has never been ceded, and to pay my respects to the custodians of that land. So I wanted to begin just by, I suppose, making some framing comments about the relationship between law and literature, and hopefully we can get to this also in the conversation. In the sense that I agree, it's completely a fallacy to think of literature as this necessarily more free and emancipatory domain compared to law, and that we can think in many ways of them, of legal imaginaries and legal thinking, having complex relationships with each other. So not necessarily to think, the law is always going to be this colonial enlightenment derived set of representations and logics, and then literature and culture can come in and sort of supplement with a way of remedying the problems with the law. But I will say to that, I think in what I have looked at in relation, especially to Indigenous representations that are coded as cultural and literary, that I suspect Australia is unique in the significance of those representations. So if we're thinking of the works of Alexis Wright, or going back 20 or 30 years, the Rabbit Proof Fence, and then the reimagination of that as a film, the significance of that point of view and that set of representations, I think becomes especially important in Australia because of, in part because sovereignty has never been ceded, and yet the Western state law system has no space for this as yet in colonial law, in our state law. So, and it doesn't, I'm not saying that our legal thinking is limited by what state law does, but I think that the cultural and literary domains are playing an incredibly important part in the Australian imaginary of law and politics. And so I wanted to look at the drover's wife today as, in a way, sort of, I suppose, symptomatic of something that I see going on, but also it's just, I think it's quite extraordinary in what it does. So what we have with Leah Purcell's recent iteration, the film iteration in 2022, is a reimagining of Henry Lawson's short story written back in 1892. And Purcell has also written a play, and that was sponsored and then shown at the Belvoir Street Theatre, and a novel version of this. And what she does in each of these versions is draw out some of the tropes that are implicit within the story, and some of the violence that actually is represented by Lawson. But more significantly, she brings out what is not said. So really the key colonial violence that was taking place historically at that time. And you can see implicitly in the story that it's there. It's just never acknowledged by Lawson or by the audiences or readers who have enjoyed this story. And I think that's sort of symptomatic and quite a sort of nice allegory of how Australia is dealing with the question of, or not dealing, or maybe starting to deal with the question of Indigenous sovereignty and what the, I suppose, the cultural feel of that is. So any Australians here probably know this story. It's been key to Australian nationalism since its publication in 1892 in the Bulletin. Henry Lawson was one of the bush poets. I know it was part of my primary school curriculum, along with the sort of sample of bush poets. It's much loved. It's been partly because it's been perceived as representing a voice from the margins. So in other words, we have not the drover, but we have this perspective from the drover's wife. And it is a compelling story, and I'm going to tell you the story so that you get a feel for it, and also for a feel for the significance of what Purcell does in her reimagining. So the drover's wife is this enduring archetype of the Australian internal frontier, the bushwoman. So she's both vulnerable and stoic, and she's symptomatic of the national imaginary of this frontier. And Australians will know that we've been through in the last 30 or 40 years, the history wars of, what is the significance of this history of violence. Everything from arguments over curriculum that should be taught in schools, to arguments about the truth of historical violence and what our responsibility is towards that violence. I feel relatively positive that in the last 5 years, especially, there's been a shift in public discourse in Australia, and that is signified by the Uluru Statement, and also the current proposal for an Indigenous voice to Parliament. And not that those are problematic proposals in themselves, but I think there's a real sense that Indigenous sovereignty is in the public mainstream imaginary, and that is significant politically and legally. And part of that shift, I think, is through cultural representation. So I think, say rabbit-proof fence as being more significant in some ways than the Hairy Ock report bringing them home in terms of making that cultural shift. Again, not necessarily unproblematic in terms of how we might think about what people are thinking and the frameworks that people are thinking. But I think it makes sense to look at these literary cultural spaces. So the idea of the bushwoman is that she's in this empty land, the arid land, this innately hostile land. And then we have the Enlightenment or colonial tropes of her labour transforming the land. So the only thing that's kind of keeping her and her children alive while her husband is away droving is her resilience, her labour. And that this leads her to deserve the inhabitation of this land. So she's very much fighting the elements. And in this story, the elements include Indigenous people who are very much coded as part of nature, requiring civilization. So you have this, they're in the frontier, they're in the border, they're at the very site of that colonial violence, except in The Drover's Wife, as Lawson writes it, it's not represented as colonial violence, it's represented as the drover's wife, fighting the elements, fighting the primary antagonist in the story is in fact a snake, and we get a sort of a description of the previous natural antagonists that she has fought. The story begins, the two-roomed house is built of round timber slabs and stringy bark and floored with split slabs. A big buck kitchen standing at one end is larger than the house itself, veranda included. Bush all around, bush with no horizon, for the country is flat. No ranges in the distance. The bush consists of stunted, rotten, native apple trees, no undergrowth, nothing to relieve the eye, save the darker green of a few she oaks, which are sighing above the narrow, almost waterless creek. 19 miles to the nearest sign of civilization, a shanty on the main road. And the drover is away. He is droving, which means a sort of herding sheep to sort of move them from pasture to pasture and then on to be sold and slaughtered, so across huge distances. And he's doing this after they had a change in fortune. So they are squatters, and they were doing reasonably well, and then various natural disasters hit them, and now he's had to go away droving for months at a time. So the story, the arc of the story is essentially a poisonous snake turns up and is a threat to the family, so to the unnamed drover's wife and the 4 children. So she tries to lure the snake out with milk, and that doesn't work. The sun's setting and the snake's under the house. And so the threat is, of course, it's going to come through the floorboards during the night and kill one of the children. So she puts them all in the kitchen, on top of the kitchen table. She sits up in her chair in the main part of the house with a large stick, and she's just waiting for this snake to emerge. And so that sets up the arc of the narrative and I guess the occasion for her thoughts. And essentially what she's thinking about are the hardships that she has had to endure. And they're essentially all natural hardships. So, for example, she thinks of a young child, a relative of hers, who has been killed by a snake. She thinks of her husband, who she hasn't heard from for 6 months. And Lawson says of him, he's a careless but good enough husband. And also, he may forget sometimes that he's married. But he gives her money to sustain herself and the children. So I'm assuming there Lawson's sort of pointing to his unfaithfulness, drunkenness. There's kind of an implicit sense that obviously that the drover isn't there, but he's not necessarily benevolent when he is there. They were ruined by drought, which is why he's gone droving. The bushwoman is pregnant. She's given birth in the bush before, assisted by a figure that Lawson describes as Black Mary, the whitest jinn in the land, end quote. Another of her children died while they were alone in the bush, and she rode 19 miles for assistance carrying a dead child. Again, sense of natural danger, distance from civilization, the constant fight of trying to use labor to sort of push against the unwavering threat of the natural world. She also remembers a time that she fought and conquered a bushfire once while her husband was away. She fought a flood during her husband's absence and, quote, dug an overflow gutter to try to save the dam across the creek, end quote, but failed. She's worked to try to save diseased cattle and, quote, fought a mad bullock that besieged the house for a day. She made her own bullets, shot him, then skinned him and sold the hide. So it's quite an extraordinary story of survival, overcoming the odds at all costs. There is a mention of the danger of other white men. So the quote is, occasionally a bushman in the horrors or a villainous looking sundowner comes and nearly scares the life out of her. And last week, a gallows-faced swagman, having satisfied himself that there were no men on the place, threw his swag down on the veranda. She fed him and then, quote, got a baton from the sofa, loosened the dog and confronted the stranger, shouting at him to go. So she lives on this perimeter between civilization and barbarism. And we also get a description of how she does the work of staying civilized. So the children, there's kind of this quite comical dialogue between the children who are swearing, and the older child is teaching the younger child how to swear, and she's admonishing them. On Sundays, she, quote, dresses herself, tidies the children, smartens up baby, and goes for a lonely walk along the bush track, pushing an old perambulator in front of her, end quote. So this very sort of poignant image of a woman dressed in her Sunday best, or whatever she's been able to cobble together at Sunday best, same with the children, and she's just walking on a bush track in the middle of nowhere. They're also described as having been squatted. So they started squatting when they were married. So in other words, they were not legally given or sold the land, but just took it. The story also says that quote, her husband is an Australian and so is she. So their claim to the territory is stated through this Australian identity, although the source of that claim is not explained. So it's implied that it's through their labour, through the squatting, whereas the Indigenous characters are treated as suspicious visitors or as interlopers. So, for example, the bushwoman goes out and finds that the firewood that was collected the day before by an Indigenous man who's described as a stray was put together in such a way to disguise the fact that he hadn't actually collected that much wood. So he tricked her. He's described as being the last of his tribe and a king. And realizing that she's being cheated, she starts to cry. And then we have this very kind of, I suppose, essentially Australian note of humour. Quote, she takes up a handkerchief to wipe the tears away, but pokes her eyes with her bare fingers instead. And then she finds holes in the handkerchief, and this makes her laugh. So the sense of the wry humour of the outback. And then the story concludes by the snake emerging, the dog becoming aware of the snake, moving forward, throttling the snake, and then the bushwoman sort of casually picks up the snake's body with a stick and then throws it onto the fire and watches it burn. And then the boy sort of infamously declares, "Mother, I won't never go drove and blast me if I do." And that's the end of the story. So it's a story that feels, I think, very familiar to Australians. It's the dominant narrative of white Australian nationhood. So the sense of the figure of the battler, the figure of enduring against the elements, and the way in which nature is very much set up as the antagonist. Lawson was also writing against the romanticism of the 19th century. So whereas white European imaginary of nature had nature itself having this kind of this gentle effect, Lawson is depicting the harsh reality of survival in Australia. But of course, what comes with that is an ideology of law, of sovereignty, of possession, very different from the Indigenous imaginary of the land and the Indigenous law, which is bound up with the land. The drover's wife has been reimagined a number of times by 20th century white writers, including Murray Bale, Barbara Jeffries, Mandy Sayer, David Island, Madeline Watts, and Ryan O'Neill. Russell Drysdale's 1945 painting The Drover's Wife was named by Frank Morehouse as our Mona Lisa. And that extends the mythology of Lawson's story. Frank Morehouse edited a collection of essays, his book of essays titled The Drover's Wife. And he, in that book, he tries to explain our ongoing fascination with his story, producing what he calls a monument to drovers' wives. So part of the popularity is that it's seen as a story from the margins, so from the bushwomen rather than the bushmen. Tony McAvoy says, in Harry Lawson's original version, he reaches out and gives voice to the women of colonial Australia, a voice hitherto barely heard, a whisper. But the story of stoicism and fortitude in the face of abject loneliness and hardship struck a chord and was almost single-handedly responsible for the creation of an archetype, the image of those women as vulnerable but refusing to surrender, perhaps because there is no choice, has a resonance that was reflected in images such as Frederick McCubben's triptych, The Pioneer, and that image has stuck. So it's against that context of white colonial fetishism of both the story and Lawson himself that Leah Purcell's versions, a play in 2016, a novel in 2021, and now a film in 2022 are set. Leah Purcell is a proud Gawangari Waka Waka Maori woman from Queensland and one of Australia's leading writers, directors and actors. She radically reimagines this text. In her reworking, she upturns this narrative and its tropes, giving a name to the drover's wife, Molly Johnson, and also truthfully naming the true antagonists of this frontier. So not nature, there's no natural force that's an antagonist in Purcell's version. In fact, the natural world is very much a source of comfort, of dreaming, of law. Rather, it's the imminent threat of violence, and especially sexual violence against all women, but particularly Purcell, who through the story is revealed to be Indigenous herself. So the character of Molly Johnson, the drover's wife. Purcell reveals the truth about the violence of the frontier, about these forms of state and outlaw violence that not only led to the massacre of Indigenous people, but also created a false epistemology, that the land which Indigenous people have inhabited with peace and ease for thousands of years is harsh, that Indigenous labour is idleness, and that the colonists' work at the frontier is noble rather than an act of ugly, violent theft. So Purcell's critiquing this role of particular Australian literary works that have been used in the creation of this national mythology and the papering over of violent historical truths. She also reveals and subverts the colonial epistemology of violence, gender and sexuality, and state law's complicity in these processes. From the imposition of a thieving land law to law's adjudication of frontier violence, and then to the lawful, in quotes, removal of Indigenous children. So, Purcell is doing, I suppose, she's working with the kind of realism that Lawson gestures towards in his short story, but she's also playing with that realism because she includes a number of, I guess, representations of violence that are not true to the year that the story is set in, 1893. So, for example, she depicts her children essentially being removed as Indigenous children under the law, so as part of the stolen generations, even though that's not going to come as a systematic process until 1910. She also has this kind of, I don't know quite what to make of it, but this quite sort of moving assembly of the sergeants wife and a few women sort of coming to support her in a kind of suffragette feminist way, which, like, you know, is historically out of time, but interesting that she includes that. So Purcell doesn't even include the snake, unless I've missed it as a sort of cameo, but it's definitely not the antagonist. The violence of colonialism is the antagonist here. And in writing it, Purcell draws on nonfiction, on her great-grandfather's story. She also draws on the genre of the Western. So the original story is, I suppose we could call it Australian Gothic. It's domestic drama. So Purcell is playing with the genre of the piece as well. And the harshness and brutality is not at all in the land in Purcell's version. In her version, that the land is extremely sort of beautiful and evocative and has a sort of a healing role in the story, whereas the brutality comes from white men. So when it begins, we have a white English couple show up at Molly's house, and we get a sense of how violent the frontier is, because Molly's first response is to draw a rifle on them because she doesn't know them. And this is the new sergeant and his wife. Molly's husband, the drover, is revealed to be a violent and alcoholic man. And we have the backstory of him beating her because she catches him with another woman, and she has actually murdered him and buried him under the wood pile. And an Indigenous outlaw, Yadika, appears at her house, and we're confronted through his stories with the realities of the frontier. He describes massacres where white settlers killed Aboriginal women and children. And then he tells Molly her own story, that he knows her and her family, that her mother was Indigenous. And Purcell says of this character of Yadika, so that story, everything that Yadika says actually comes from diaries that were written. Everything the stockmen say when they're around with Molly and what they say to Yadika was taken from diaries to superiors and how they spoke about Aboriginal people. So, and this is part of Purcell's project to reclaim historical record. So this sense of colonial amnesia in Australia is being repaired through these sorts of acts. A white officer comes searching for Yadika, and Molly shoots the officer dead. And Molly and Yadika have this intimacy, of really an element of desire. And Yadika invites him to come with him to a cave, which is 2.5 days walk away, and which is connected to her people. It's a litany of violence and adversary, but it's white settler violence. So there's sexual violence. Molly is raped by two neighbouring men who are coming in search for her husband. Very much this sense that there's a gender hierarchy, but also telling this story as an Indigenous woman, obviously adds another element to that. Molly ultimately castrates her rapist, but the sergeant catches her, imprisons her, and despite the appeals of his wife, she's hanged. But we see the future through her children. So she's hanged, and it's a kind of spiritual. I mean, obviously it's an ugly scene, but it's also this sense of this spiritual reclaiming of the land. And then we see her 4 children walking to the place that Yadika described, and reintegrating into that land. So I think in the sense that Purcell is playing with realism and history here, it feels very important as a representation in 2022. I think where the nation is negotiating the current Indigenous voice, the proposal of Indigenous voice to Parliament, the Uluru Statement. And I think it's very much a film where sovereignty, especially sovereignty through land and dreaming, and this sense of Indigenous law is very much at the foreground. And it seems to have got quite, a very positive reception through viewers, and I hope it's symptomatic of what I hope I'm feeling correctly, which is that in the last 5 or so years that we do have a sense of the public imaginary changing around Indigenous sovereignty, around the history of colonialism, and around our responsibilities. So sorry for going over time, and I'll leave it there.